Welcome back to Terror and Urban Myths. Don't forget to hit subscribe and give us a like if you're enjoying these explorations. You know, the dark side of history and folklore. Well, today we're really diving into a name that's been around for centuries. Vlad Dracula.
Synonymous with cruelty.
Oh, absolutely. Synonymous with cruelty. And you can't really say Dracula without thinking about vampires.
Right.
But how did a 15th century prince end up being the most famous bloodsucker? I mean, that's the big question. That's what we're going to try to uncover today.
It's quite a journey, and it all begins in Wallachia,
Okay.
which is present-day Romania.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a land just steeped in folklore. Mountains, forests, so many secrets just as old as time. This is where Vlad III was born. He would later be known as Vlad Dracula.
Right.
And his father, Vlad II, he was a member of the Order of the Dragon.
Oh, wow.
A chivalric order, and they were really dedicated to defending Christendom from, well, the ever-encroaching Ottoman Empire.
So, I mean, right from the start, we see Vlad's life is just surrounded by conflict. This sense of like a looming threat. Not exactly your typical childhood.
No.
Especially when you consider that he and his brother Radu were sent as hostages to the Ottoman Sultan.
Precisely. And this was no summer camp, exchange program. This was a strategic move by the Ottomans. They really wanted to make sure that Wallachia stayed loyal. For young Vlad, though, it would have been a brutal, brutal education and power, politically and militarily.
Yeah. I mean, seeing how the Ottomans worked, right? Their courts, their military strategies, and I'm sure, some of their more ruthless practices as well.
Yes.
It couldn't have left him, unchanged.
Of course not.
Do you think that these experiences really kind of shaped the ruler he would become?
Absolutely. I think it's very likely that Vlad really honed his understanding of psychological warfare from the Ottomans because they were masters of it.
Right.
And it seems that he really did learn those lessons well.
Yeah.
Though he added his own brutal twist.
Yeah. And that brings us to his, infamous reign, the Reign of Terror, as it's called. And we can't really shy away from this. Vlad's reputation for cruelty is a big part of history. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting from a historical point of view is why he chose those particular methods, like impalement, for example. It wasn't just about execution. It was a spectacle.
Exactly. It was meant to send a very specific message. You see, in the 15th century, public displays of power were everything. And impalement, with its slow, agonizing death.
Right.
It wasn't just about punishment. It was about instilling absolute terror.
Fear.
And a terrified populace is, well, a compliant one. Vlad understood that.
On a very deep level.
Yeah.
It's chillingly effective, even if it repulses our modern sensibilities.
Yeah.
But this wasn't just some, mindless brutality, was it?
Right.
Vlad had a political agenda. He wanted order in a region that was always, on the brink of chaos.
He did. He saw himself as a defender of Wallachia, a bulwark against internal strife and external enemies. And in that context, you could say that his ruthlessness was a tool, a terrifying one. But a tool nonetheless. His goal was to create a Wallachia, well, free of corruption and treachery where his word was law.
But the price was high.
It was indeed, and that ruthlessness, that reliance on fear, well, it eventually led to his downfall, didn't it?
Right, because his enemies grew, both inside Wallachia and out.
That's right. His most formidable opponent was Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. His ambition was to expand the Ottoman Empire further into Europe. Now, Vlad's tactics, as effective as they were at the time, they just couldn't hold back that tide forever. But perhaps his most audacious, his most horrifying act of defiance was the creation of the Forest of Impaled.
Right. Chilling. Thousands upon thousands of Ottoman soldiers left on stakes as a warning.
A warning to the advancing army.
I mean, just imagine the psychological impact.
It was immense, a bold move, even reckless. It did stall the Ottoman advance, but it also really cemented Vlad's reputation for just sheer inhumanity across all of Europe. And the stories of his brutality, well, they spread like wildfire.
Amplified by his enemies, for sure. And I bet they got a little more embellished with each retelling.
Of course. So even while he was alive, that line between Vlad the Man and Vlad the Monster, well, it was already getting blurry.
Right. But how did that transition happen? How did he go from brutal prince to a creature of the night, a vampire?
Well, it all starts with his downfall. You see, he was betrayed by his own nobles, forced into exile in Hungary.
Wow.
But even in defeat, the stories about him, they didn't die. They just mutated. Whispers among the people becoming more and more fantastical.
Whispers of dark magic, a spectral presence haunting his abandoned castle. It's like that void left by his absence was filled with, well, something sinister.
Precisely. And that's where we see the seeds of the vampire myth starting to take root. We'll explore that transformation in more detail later. But what's important is that the groundwork was laid during Vlad's lifetime. He wasn't just a cruel ruler. He was a figure who inspired fear and fascination, the perfect breeding ground for all those supernatural tales that would follow. Yeah, Vlad's reputation really set the stage for the whole vampire myth. But what's interesting is how specific traits, the ones we instantly think of with vampires, got layered onto that. It wasn't instant, more of an evolution.
Right. Blood-drinking creatures have been in folklore forever, way before Vlad Dracula. But his story, it's like a catalyst,
Right.
It took all those beliefs and turned them into a real archetype. Where do you think those specific traits, the vampire hallmarks, came from?
Well, let's think about that need to sleep in coffins full of dirt from their homeland. Sounds totally supernatural, right? But when you dig deeper, you find these echoes of old burial practices. The Slavs, for instance, they'd bury their dead with stuff from home. Like they needed a connection to their roots, even in death.
So that practice, when you apply it to, being stuck between life and death, it becomes a stronger need. Like their power, their whole existence depends on that soil, that connection to home.
Exactly. It shows how these crazy, fantastical elements often come from real cultural stuff. Like the garlic and holy symbols thing. Garlic, strong smell. It was thought to ward off evil. And holy symbols, well, in a world steeped in religion, they were powerful against anything demonic.
Makes sense. If you believe in that spiritual world and you see something that just defies nature, of course you'd turn to what you think protects you. But what about bats? That seems more symbolic, right?
It is symbolic, but there's logic there too. Bats, they're creatures of the night hiding in the dark. They were already bad omens in folklore. And the way they feed, well, people didn't understand it. A creature that comes out at night, disappears into the shadows, feeds on blood. It's not that hard to see the connection.
No, not at all. And we can't forget the main thing that makes a vampire, drinking blood. It's primal, it's visceral, and there's so much meaning there. Why do you think that act is so central to the whole myth?
Blood has always been the essence of life. It's what keeps us going. It's not a coincidence that lots of cultures have beliefs and rituals about blood. Drinking it in different situations could mean taking someone's strength, their life force. With vampires, it's twisted. They need it. They're undead. So they have to consume life essence to keep going.
It's like a dark version of communion, isn't it? Taking the blood and body of Christ for spiritual food. But for a vampire, it's just physical, but with a dark twist.
Yeah, that's a great point. The vampire myth plays with religious stuff, twists it to make it feel really strange and forbidden. So you've got folklore, superstition, religious fears, historical facts, all wrapped up in Vlad Dracula. But how did this regional figure become the global icon we know?
Yeah, that's the real mystery, isn't it? I mean, how did this Wallachian prince, brutal as he was, become, the ultimate vampire?
Well, that's where Bram Stoker comes in. His novel, Dracula, published in 1897, gothic horror.
Yeah.
He took everything, the history, the folklore, those whispers of the supernatural, and made it into a story. And the world just ate it up.
Dracula's like the vampire Bible. It didn't just borrow from Vlad's life. It gave us the vampire we all know, The weaknesses, the allure, the monster. Why do you think it resonated so much?
Well, a few things. The timing.
Yeah.
Late 19th century, so much change socially, scientifically.
Yeah.
People were fascinated by the occult, afraid of disease, of the unknown. Vampires, these creatures on the edge of life and death, they just tapped into all that anxiety.
And Stoker was smart. He didn't just make Dracula a monster. He was an aristocrat, Sophisticated, even seductive, added a whole other layer of fear. This wasn't some beast in the shadows. It could be someone charming right there with you.
Exactly. He was a product of his time, but he also became something more, a symbol of temptation, of those desires you're not supposed to have, the darkness hiding under the surface. And Victorian England, they were all about repressed desires, anxieties about sex, about breaking the rules. Dracula gave all that a face.
And that image, the one Stoker created, keeps changing with us, Classic horror to modern movies, addiction, alienation, even romantic heroes, but with a dark side. What do you think keeps this myth alive?
I think it's because the vampire myth, deep down, it's about being human, fear of death, wanting to live forever. The fight between our bad impulses and wanting connection, wanting love. Those are things everyone understands, no matter when or where you're from.
In Dracula, he's a monster, but he's in that fight too. This thirst he can't satisfy. Living forever, but cut off from everything that makes us human. He's tragic. You almost feel for him,
Absolutely. He's repulsive, but you're drawn to him. And drinking blood, it's more than just feeding. It's like he's trying to grab life again. Close that gap between being undead and the world he can't be part of. It won't work, but it shows you how much he wants it.
So, from Vlad the Impaler, this prince in a brutal time, we get Dracula, a global icon. He's not just our fears, he's our desires, our struggles. It really shows you how history and myths get tangled up. And the monsters we make. They often show us something about ourselves.
And maybe it also shows how the line between man and monster, between what's real and the stories we tell, maybe that line's a lot thinner than we think. Vlad's brutality turned into legend. Our actions can have consequences we don't see coming, shape the stories that come after us.
Well, thanks for joining us on this journey. History, folklore, the making of a legend. We hope you found it, illuminating, a little creepy maybe. If you did, be sure to subscribe to Terror and Urban Myth so you don't miss out on future explorations. And don't forget to give us a like if you enjoyed the episode. We'll see you next time for another look into the unsettling and the uncanny.